let us now turn to the next very important theme, education equity. At the moment, revitalization of the rural area in China becomes a very key priority for the government. And today we have brought together many practitioners who would be sharing with us the challenges they encounter in their work. And we would like to give the floor now to Chen Ruishi and Zhang Hongyuan, panel directors for this panel. Good morning, good evening. Thank you very much for coming to the 13th CES. And today we're at the panel discussing education equity. My name is Ruishi. I am one of the panel directors. Welcome. I am a student at Emory University, and my majors are applied math and statistics and sociology. Today, we also have with us Zhang Hongyuan, and Zhang Hongyuan is going to be the moderator for our roundtable discussion. Today, in our panel, we would like to jointly discuss these two very important questions. What does education equity mean after the campaign of poverty alleviation, and also looking at the differences between education in urban and rural areas. As an ordinary citizen, how can we help rural schools to obtain the opportunity to construct or achieve education equity? So in the next 90 minutes, let's try to redefine education equity, understand the policies in place, and understand the perspectives from the practitioners trying to look at solutions. And we would like to also invite you to proactively engage with us by sending questions in the chat box or using the screen conversations. Allow me to introduce to you our speakers for this panel. We have Chen Si. Dr. Chen Si is a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We have Professor Qin Yuyou from the Northeast Normal University. We have Mr. Hong Zhizhao, Director of the Rural Center of 21st Century Education Research Institute, and Professor Wang Zheng. 做更详细的介绍，敬请期待。那么接下来就让我们有请出今天。All right, so let us now go into the contents brought to us by Dr. Chen Si, lecturer and postdoctoral fellow of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She focuses on the language and literacy 儿童读写发展所产生的影响。目前呢，陈博士 of research education, and she focuses on the rural regions in China and designs experiments and observe the education intervention on the learning of languages for young children. Thank you very much, moderator. Allow me to lead you in this discussion on the 0 to 6 years of age preschool education in China. Next page, please. As the moderator
教育公平问题，我们首先要考虑
about, we are talking about education equity, and we need to understand there is a giant gap between the rural and urban areas. 2/3 of the children live in rural areas, and only 30% of those children can receive a complete preschool education. So 3 years of preschool education. In China, there are a lot of early childhood education literature that talks about the giant development gap between children living in urban regions and rural regions. In my own research, if we look at vocabulary development, we can see that there is a development gap of 1 year or 18 months. Will we be able to bridge that gap in the primary and senior high school education? It is not that optimistic. We're actually looking at the national government trying to invest into that gap to make sure the gap is shortened. And the National Long-Term Plan 2020 has realized that 85% of the children can receive a 3-year early childhood education. But within the 85%, 97% were actually urban children. And so the bottom 15%, most of them live in the villages and rural areas. So today I'd like to talk about 3 major areas of critical challenge. The first one is from 0 to 1, talking about enrollment. Are there opportunities for rural children to be enrolled in preschool education? And the second is one to more. Can we increase ECE service time and scale? And the third is from more to better. Can we actually improve teaching and interaction quality? And this is the key question as we talk about education reform in rural areas. Next page, please. So here I would like to talk to you about the largest national action plan that was founded by the CDRF, the China Development Research Foundation. The name of the project is the One Village, One Preschool project. This is targeting the most poverty-stricken areas and ethnic minority areas, and focusing on disadvantaged children living in these areas. And today, with my Harvard colleagues at the CIRIC lab, we have had a series of research into the OVOP project and talk about how it has tried to answer the major challenges for preschool education in rural areas in China. The OVOP project has been in place for 13 years. Before, it was called village kindergartens. As its name suggests, there is an ambition to provide preschool education for villages that have more than 10 young children in the same village. So volunteers and teachers are going to be recruited, providing also nutrition and early education to the children. It has gained strong support from local governments and other NGOs, and it covers 12 provinces with a total of more than 2,800 centers, serving 300,000 children. Next page, please. How did it try to address the challenges? Next page, please. All right, so let's look at 2012 Qinghai Ledu data, and this actually talks about how they've met the challenge from 0 to 1. Next page, please.
并且使用了小学的长期追踪的学业成绩进行分析，发现参加过一村一园的儿童呢，他们的学业发展速度是显著优于没有接受过学前教育或者是在县城接受私立学前教育的儿童的。这一个发现呢是具有这个因果推论效应的。下一页。青海乐都呢是一村一园的第一个试点县，当时的一村一园呢最初只有半天的服务时间，老师呢也是兼职的。这并不是我们传统意义上认为的这种高质量的学前教育模式，但是它仍然体现出了非常显著的效果。这是为什么呢？我们通过对比其他几种类型的学前教育安置在当地，发现一村一园的作用机制呢，可能是因为它更加的融入山村，它在儿童步行就可以去到的地方设立这个教学点，就在孩子的家的周围，它更有机会能够融入社区，能够和家庭产生联动。更可贵的呢是山村幼儿园一村一园的项目，它有着比其他类型的学校更高的师生比。下一页。第二个挑战呢是从1到多，我们使用了来自贵州松桃一村一园的数据来回答这个问题。在所有的这个教育投资当中呢，我们都需要非常非常谨慎的去考虑一个性价比的问题。也就是说，当我们投入更多的钱、更多的时间，为孩子提供了更多的服务之后呢，是否能够获得正向应当的嘛。然而就国为例呢，其实多年对于投入学前教育的追踪研究，却发现了一个让人失望的消失效应。所谓的消失效应呢，就是在学前教育的这个积极干预产生的显著效果呢，却往往会在小学3年级之后呢，发现消失不见了。这种消失效应呢，其实它提醒我们，对学前教育的投入呢，它可能会产生的效果并不是线性的。学前教育产生效果的机制也很复杂。那么中国农村是否也会观察到这种消失效应呢？我们的答案是 yes and no。我们使用来自贵州松桃超过2万名儿童从学1年级到4年级的追踪数据，同样通过具有因果推论的数据模型的拟合呢，发现消失效应它也存在于效果显著的干预项目中。大家可以看到呢，在这里呢有一个这个绿颜色的这个 V 字形，这里呢其实就是这个消失效应的体现，也是在小学的3年级。 但是儿童如果能够获得多1年的一村一园干预，也就是3年的一村一园干预的话，这个消失效应就能被克服，也就是图中大家看到黄色的这条线，它没有这个微型的波谷。在这个研究里，我们发现呢，2年的一村一园项目的效应大小大概是0.11个标准差，而3年的一村一园呢有0.35个标准差。同时，3年的项目儿童也克服了这个消失效应，这是第一个类似的研究当中发现学前教育的服务时长增加能够提供给儿童额外的克服消失效应的发现。下一页。第3个挑战呢，也是一个最艰巨的挑战，就是从多到好。在农村呢，我们如何能够实现学前教育的质量提升呢？我和斯诺教授担任首席研究员的研究团队，从2019年开始呢，我们就在云南西畴的80个一村一园的班级开展了大规模的随机对照干预研究。下一页。这里呢是这个80个班级在地图上的分布，大家可以看到红色是实验班，蓝色是对照班。下一页。实验组的教师呢，他参加了我们的 CIRIC 质量提升干预。我们的干预呢是以课程和教师培训为核心的内容，通过图画书作为载体，为每个班级根据班额大小配备86到160本图画书每个学期，并且根据这些图画书呢，我们设计了超过120个整合的主题活动，为教师开展了长达2个学期的线上和线下的培训。线下培训呢是每学期开学，线上培训
We also provided a lot of trainings, both online and offline, and sometimes it's on WeChat. And we also looked at the implementation programs as well as vocabulary development and also quality of teachers as the variables. And with a random comparison, we looked at the differences between the experiment and control groups. After 1 semester of intervention, we saw that for children, after variables of age and such were controlled, their level of comprehension of vocabulary increased by 0.27 and 0.23 standard deviations compared to their peers. And also in terms of social and emotional skills, there was no obvious difference. And also comparing these 2 groups, we saw that the interaction quality among teachers also increased by 0.43 standard deviation. And we see interactions of teachers in terms of quality can significantly improve, which shows that rural education improvement can truly be enhanced through investment into teachers, such as trainings, which is the hypothesis of ours. And we always try to discover more connections between a teacher and students. And we have a goal, which is by 2025, 100% of children should be covered by preschool education, at least for 3 years. And OBOP has provided a solid foundation for achieving that goal. And for Siri and experiments of kind, we would like to inspire more practitioners to increase inclusive preschool education while ensuring the quality so that students can get more enriched learning experience. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Chen Si, for the wonderful sharing. I believe your research on rural education quality will surely inspire more like-minded people after learning more about preschool education. Let's look at the national education policies, which is a different perspective. Let's see what progress has been made in this regard. And now let's give the floor to Professor Qin Yuyou, Vice Chancellor, Professor and Doctoral Advisor of China Institute of Rural Education Department of Northwestern Normal University. And since 2000, he has published papers including Basic Judgment and Governance for the Development of Small-Scale Rural Schools. And now let's see how he interprets education equity from a different perspective. Welcome. Good morning or good evening. Dear colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, And I would like to focus on national efforts and strategic choices to promote education equity. Well, this concerns the well-being of all individuals from the national level in terms of rural rejuvenation and achieving moderately prosperous society. The government has been a backbone. Education has been the attention of both the government and the society today. I want to look at the equity of from the beginning to the end and from efforts to the results. And this, as I said, has been in the spotlight of all members of society. My presentation has three parts. First, national efforts on increasing education equity. And there have been efforts in all fronts, but China as such a large cause. Well, the government takes the predominant role in this regard. And second part is challenges. Well, for the time being and for a long time to come, what are the challenges are confronting education equity in China? Third, well, with the foundation provided by the government, and how will uh, the education equity look like with the efforts that we make? Let's start with the efforts from the national level. The Communist Party of China and the government focus a lot on education, in particular education equity, which is decided by the nature of the society. So the individual well-being is definitely on a focus. So these are the efforts from the national level. But in the interest of time, I'll focus only three things. And first is all the party congresses in the past always have two highlights. First, progress and achievements from the past, and second, planning into the future. And from that, we see the Communist Party attaches great importance to compulsory education in 1987. And we started to implement the 9-year mandatory education. After mandatory education law was passed, the enforcement followed suit, and efforts were made to enhance that in following party congresses. And from the enrollment rate, we could see the past laurels. The achievements of mandatory education would reflect that great milestones were mounted in 2017 and 2000 when the rural education was made free of charge entirely. Well, the rural and urban disparity largely was due to the burden of education, and that is why in 2017 we achieved free mandatory education across China. In 2000. Actually, in 2008, it was made free of charge in urban areas, but and we then in order to increase equality, made education free for both urban and rural areas. And that reflects the integration of rural and urban education, as well as our concentration on improving rural education. Of course, the party congress had other highlights and achievements over the years. Every year, China has the two sessions on the Congress meetings in spring. And during the two sessions, mandatory education is also a priority. And since 2012, we have gone through a long trajectory from education priority to quality and quality of education, and which has always been a strategic deployment of the two sessions, or the integration of rural and urban education, as well as the focus on rural education quality. But I'm not going to elaborate on that further. Now let's look at specific policies. For instance, the specialized policies. We see mandatory education again is a key focus. Well, mandatory education is just a part of the education policy. Well, it is the main component, to say the least. During the two sessions every year, mandatory education is always discussed first before other types of education. We also can see among the specialized education, well, in 2005, there was already an opinion made by Ministry of Education on the balanced development of mandatory education. And then in 2010, 2012, 2016, and 17, more specialized policies were introduced to consolidate the balanced and equitable development of mandatory education. Targets were set and achieved over the years. We can see some quantitative data. This is what I was talking about from 2013 to 2020. We see on counties that achieved equitable mandatory education and their share in China. So by 2020, we already reached 96.80% in the national target. So the county level education already had achieved equity, which is very encouraging. That's our achievement. Just a quick review of our accomplishments. And now the second part, the challenges in China in terms of education equity. How do we understand challenges? We see and recognize achievements made by China, but the landscape has changed. Now we look at quality-driven development. Well, what are the challenges here? Let's start with the first one.
The first challenge is on the funding. As we know that the 4% GDP target has been reached, but it is still inadequate and imbalance if we were to look at the requirement of high quality development. In 2012, we've reached the goal of an investment into education reaching 4% of the GDP. It has provided a foundation of funding. However, investment into mandatory education compulsory education is still not adequate and not balanced. And this is shown in two areas. Within a region, there is a big room for funding equity to improve within the region for the allocation of the funding. And at the moment, compulsory education teachers' salaries have been guaranteed. However, with two areas where in counties there hasn't been a active or proactive differentiation, which we will explain later. And then for rural teachers, compensation income systems will need to be improved. So for the small scale schools in rural villages, might receive the funding. However, the calculation method is overly simplified. So for example, 200 yuan per student for a school that has less than 100 students. And for the boarding schools, 200 yuan subsidy per student. It is actually quite coarse that it needs to be refined and improved to guide the allocation of fund. The next challenge is in faculty. We can see a very steady improvement of the quality of the faculty. The education for teachers have significantly improved, but there is still a very big difference between urban and rural areas. In the Midwest part and rural schools, the ratio of teachers with higher education or relatively high education degree backgrounds or qualifications would be lower than schools in the East and in the cities. And because of the continued optimization of the subject setup, there needs to be more teachers in subjects including computer science, foreign language, STEM subjects, and so on and so forth. And then we're looking at the professional standings for teachers in rural areas where they have less senior teachers and grade 1 teachers compared to urban schools. Next page, please. And the next challenge is on the facilities. So the standardization of school building needs to be a long-term project. At the moment, we're looking at difficulties, especially over the past 2 years with the pandemic. Information technology facilities are not presented in an equal and just way. And I have limited time, so I'll rush a little bit. There is a pretty big gap between the IT facilities for rural and urban schools. And this is a major issue. Sometimes the schools are equipped with the facilities, but these are not being used adequately. They're not being used fully in the teaching. So these are the areas that require further improvement. I won't go into details here. What about solutions or future directions? As we talk about strategies and directions, there are several things that we need to talk about. The near term, midterm, and long term. In the short term, we need to look at what we can do. We'll do what we can do. And for the midterm, look at our bottlenecks and our problems and try to resolve that. And with the long term, we need to look at the trend of education development. So when we talk about strategies, mostly we would look at the mid to long term. Of course, we'll start from under our feet, but we have to also have a forward-looking perspective. And so we have been repeating this point. How are we going to be able to deepen the impact of active differentiation? The active differentiation is a differentiation that would help the positive allocation of education resources to the remote areas and rural areas. And this is already reflected in the current allocation of resources. In the future, we need to continue to improve this differentiation. We need to actually look at how we can allocate resources more actively and more accurately to the weak links in the rural schools. We need to also try to improve on the scale and enjoy the benefits of scale of economy and provide basic level of education services. And for boarding schools, they have an extra function, which is the dormitories for students. And this need to be taken into consideration, and resources need to incline towards these schools as well. Differentiation in the building up of the teachers or the faculty in these schools. We are all very clear on this point. Teachers are the transformational elements for the quality of education. If you have good teachers, you have good education. If you have bad teachers, you can't have good education. And so teachers would be the key for the further improvement of the education quality. So they would both be the strongest link and the weakest link. So we need to pay attention to how we build up that faculty. And this actually is something that needs to be done both in the rural areas and urban areas. We need to observe the different expenses and costs that teachers have to pay as they work in rural schools, and this needs to be compensated for. And for teachers who would go and teach in the remote and poverty-stricken areas, they also need to be incentivized for that. You can't just order them to go simply, and you can't just motivate them to go with words. You must also provide them with financial compensation in addition to moral encouragement. Also, there needs to be a standardized access threshold for rural teachers. And so we would lift the entry standards to improve the quality of rural teachers. And thirdly, we must understand that teaching is a profession that requires lifelong teaching. We must provide them with the learning opportunities to help them improve professionally. The next challenge is in the facilities. The core to the future development is we can't simply just provide hardware, making luxury-looking classrooms. The biggest thing to the facilities would be IT technology. So this is something we need to pay special attention to and realize the role played by IT to the development of education and bridge that IT gap between urban and rural schools. And we need to improve the qualities of rural teachers in using IT to teach, and policies need to be supported to promote the IT improvement in rural education. These are easier said than done, and we need to really look at how critical IT facilities and the use of IT facilities is to the development of rural education. And this is something we must look at, because we can then share high quality education resources, and we will be able to transfer knowledge and information using the system. Now, these are some of my modest observations of this topic. Thank you for your attention. Well, thank you very much, Professor Qin, for that. After your interpretation, we believe that we all have a better understanding of the current policies and the challenges met in promoting equity in education. Of course, in addition to policies, there needs to be work done at the front line. So we would like to now give the floor to a frontline teachers representative. And the floor is now given to Mr. Zhao Hongzhi, Director of the Rural Center of 21st Century Education Research Institute. He had worked on the front line, and we would like to hear from him. The floor is yours, please. Professor Qin, Dean Wang, Dr. Chen, my name is Zhao Hongzhi. Good morning and evening to you all. I have been working in the Rural Center of 21st Century Education Research Institute, which is a think tank looking at education research and advocacy, and we are leaning on the support of the civic society to promote development of education. As you all know, after June 1st, 2021, China has implemented and put into effect the Revitalization of Rural Areas Act. And the key to that act was development of rural education. In our research institute, this falls under the research portfolio of our team. Next page, please. Next page. Looking at this chart, this is in the past 20 years, the number of rural schools and its changing trend. And you can see 20 years ago, primary schools have been quite a high number compared to what it is now. There are three types of schools in the rural areas, and this is a new situation. At the moment, in counties, we have class sizes that are really big, super classrooms, and then you have in villages, boarding schools, which is usually in a township center, and the third type would be a village school. But village schools are now showing a new phenomena where you have these small size classes. Our research institute and other scholars believe that it is necessary to maintain these village schools, even though the number of students are really small, and because the children there are usually very young, they're kindergarten aged or under year 3 in schools, so they shouldn't be away from their family, and the government needs to support for them to receive education close to home. And so we are actually noticing that in a lot of regions in China, there are two marginalized groups. One are the left behind children, the other are the group of children who are following their migrant worker parents. And these are the two biggest challenges that are faced in education these days in China. Next page. So Professor Yang Dongping in 2013 has first raised the idea of small-scale schools. In China, small-scale schools refer to village or grassroots schools with 200 students or less, and the government has been supporting these schools regardless of the number of students. Sometimes you can have as few as 1 student or 200 students. You receive 60,000 yuan subsidy each year. So more and more village schools are now receiving policy support, hardware support, and the allocation of education funding. It is quite adequate. However, because we don't have as many schools as before, so we're paying more attention to whether or not the content of rural education represents. Next page, please. Next page. So looking at rural schools, the functions have changed greatly. In the past, after we have hardware in place, we have teachers in place, and we have subjects in place. These are all in preparation for education. But nowadays, more and more schools in more and more regions are paying attention to the nurturing and caring of the students, including free nutritional breakfasts and nutritional lunches. Many schools have established their own student care facilities. And we can see in the southern part of China, many schools now have flushing toilets and shower stalls. And these were quite rare 10 years ago. So over the past decade, there has been a lot of improvement in this sense. Next page, please.
Now, education in rural areas is more than just academic programs, but also features on PE, art, and including competitions and contests between different schools. And this has become more and more common now in rural areas. And next, a few observations that I've made over the past few years. For 21st Education Research Institute, we opened association for rural schools in 2011. We have a lot of innovation models initiated by these what we call small-scale schools, on which we did research in Chuxiong and Wei Shan. Professor Kang Jian opened 2 primary schools. And we had a very big team of volunteers under the Chinese strategy of Beautiful China. Our goal is to support lifelong learning and to really benefit them with life education. And Fanjiang, a primary school in Guangyuan city of Sichuan, is located in the deep mountains. Now the school has much less students compared to the past. we see that there are less than 100 students only. Despite the size, Principal Zhang Pingyuan utilized a variety of concepts and then formed what we call school-based education. So they developed their own life education pamphlets and textbooks, which included habits and local practices in that area. This school has become a model in China, in particular mountainous regions. Also in the same province, there is a town called Liangshan, which is a big base of poverty alleviation. Lots of volunteers were sent to the rural schools there for all sorts of activities. Well, rural schools usually are facing shortage of good teachers. So there is a structural challenge in terms of the skill set of teachers. But we had volunteers who went over to provide modern education. So regardless of its remote location, the students could still receive a good and diverse education. Let's go back to Jinyun County in Lishui of Zhejiang Province. There are a lot of boarding schools in that mountainous area. This Changkeng Primary School for over a decade and has really kept its music program with the Chinese traditional musical instruments, which is not part of the mandatory art education program. Traditional instruments are actually easier to procure and it's easier to source on trainers. At the Changkeng primary school actually decided to inherit the traditional culture, which has often been on the sideline these days. And in Zheng'an County's Tianzigo Primary School, we had this lady who used to study in Denmark. She came back to China and built a future school on the top of the mountain in Guizhou province, south of China. And she wanted to develop the rural people-centric curriculum which retains the originality of the life there. And also in these areas, lots of parents go to the cities to work as migrant workers. But this school really cares for the children that are left behind. And now let's go back to Tanchang, located in northwest China, province called Gansu. It's also very remote. And natural conditions are quite rough, which is challenging to the teachers. But with the efforts of Mr. Chan, the principal, it has been converted into a school that provides a lot of support, not only to children, but also parents and grandparents in that area. We see that reforms are definitely gathering space in China in terms of rural education, ranging from resources of teaching and learning, as well as students themselves. In the past, rural areas in China always had only private facilities, but now they are supported with public resources after a reform in the past few years. So now teachers working in these rural schools have the state support program, including their pension and salary, that also helps with a fundamental change of their social status and how they are viewed by the society. we really welcome such structural support from the government, and this helps more young people to devote themselves to the rejuvenation of rural areas and rural education. We know rural areas in China have undergone profound changes in recent years, and with our efforts, I really hope the rural authenticity and traditions can be retained with quality education, and with the efforts of generations to come. Our research institute, with the support and encouragement of you all, would love to devote more resources to the rejuvenation of rural education. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zhao. Every time when I hear stories after this, I always am profoundly touched. That also shows the charisma of education itself. Now let's learn more about education equity. Apart from frontline teachers, we also have others that really been active on the very front line, and they are the public interest or the charity on individuals in this area. Now let's give the floor to and Mr. Wang Zhenyao, a dean of Beijing Normal University of China Philanthropy Research Institute, founder and president of China Global Philanthropy Institute. Since 2010, he has completed a lot of important programs related to charity law and policy reform, child welfare, and senior citizen service system reform. And so please, the floor is yours, Professor Wang. Thank you very much. I've been really inspired by the previous three speakers, especially what Hongzhi mentioned. Their stories really are encouraging. After joining Beijing Normal University, it could be said I've had lots of contacts with education. Now, the nation as a whole is promoting what UNICEF calls on centers and village program, which means an education director should be appointed in every village. That is related to both the rural and urban education. I want to look at education equity from the perspective of philanthropy or charity. So several points that I would like to address today. Let's start with my first observation. Well, when it comes to the education disparity between rural and urban areas, I find it rather bizarre because this angle shows inequality itself being rather strange. It is strange because of five things. Well, I visit cities and villages quite often. I find cities lack these five things. And we'll think in higher education institutes, primary and middle schools, and they have the same common shortnesses. And even in good universities, I don't find toilet paper and toilets, let alone middle and elementary schools. The urban areas are very different from rural areas. Without toilet papers, it is really inconvenient, but teachers don't even see that as a problem. Neither do our administrative individuals. Well, this affects everyone, but they just don't realize it. I advocate that a lot, but no one is really, on retweeting my voice on it. Well, I think it is a big challenge. Well, children, can contract illnesses because of lacking of toilet paper, and students sometimes just pour the drinks that their parents prepare for them on after school is over at around 3 or 4 p.m. just because they don't want to drink the water in order to avoid using the toilets. And then dehydration is the problem, but the school administration completely overlooks it. And the second is lacking of hands-on activities. Urban children know very little about, for instance, crops grown in the field. And they have a big gap in terms of these hard knowledge compared to rural peers. And third, a lacking of communication skills, which is prevalent. And many students can't speak without a script. In Harvard University, there is the communication, class. Well, in China, we have the same, but and during lectures, the students learn the definition of communication. They memorize on definitions, but they still don't know how to communicate without scripts. Speech or speaking is very important from middle school. And next is lacking sports facilities. In the past, these facilities were rarely or never used. And now things are a bit better, but we lack good sports facilities. And it is more severe in residential compounds. Next is lacking volunteer programs or social service programs. And now urban population living in isolation, we rarely know who our neighbors are. And that's different from rural areas where everyone greets others in alleys and on the streets. And so I don't know which one is better, rural or urban. Maybe we should spend more efforts on making urban resources to have more rural touch. And now we have made so many efforts on improving education. Rural areas are trying to be more urban, but I don't think we are respecting the inheritance of traditional culture and such. And this progress, like Hongzhi said, in the past, the rural schools have blindly followed all patterns of the urban schools, but I don't think these 5 lackings or 5 shortcomings should also be copied in rural areas. I think we need to really clarify the core of education, and we need to think about a rural versus the urban education equity at a broader scale.
Second, I would like to talk about is the new generation of rural education. There is actually a very rich essence of education equity tradition, which is that education shall be provided to all kinds of people. It doesn't matter your background, your wealth, whether or not you're of a higher social class, whether or not you're smart, or whether or not you're a kind person or not. We must notice as we discuss education equity between urban and rural areas, in the wide rural areas in China, people would think of it as a backward place, but in the practice, we can actually see that even though Chinese cities have been destroyed time after time, China's rural education and rural civilization has never stopped. Cities could be destroyed in war. However, the root of the culture, the essence of the culture is still in the villages. And very important part of that heritage is in the rural areas. There were private tutorials where teachers could hold classes in their own private homes. And this is something that is a unique strength that we must pay attention to. As we look at education equity, there is a need for us to reinterpret Confucius' ideas and Chinese civilization. Education traditions in China was started by Confucius, and this was a very strong route for the civilization to pass from generation to generation. And this is a very special and unique way of intergenerational knowledge passing on. So the education, the learning, and the doing of daily practices are actually combined into one. And the Chinese cultural tradition, if you were to compare it to other civilizations, there is something that is very unique to how we pass on knowledge. For example, the 24 solar terms. This is a very typical case. Farmers who do not read, who are illiterate, will be able to retain and pass on that knowledge. Next page, please. So my recommendation here is that we need to pay attention to the unique learning capabilities of the Chinese. And we look at the systemic structure of education equity. Should it be reshaped or rebuilt? Chinese entrepreneur Cao Dewang once said that the Chinese have a very unique ability to learn. And what he meant by that was not something that students would go to schools to learn. Next page, please. What I would like to share with you on that point is the Chinese race has actually very uniquely learned and internalized Buddhism. The Chinese Communist Party has creatively learned Marxism, Leninism, and today the Chinese society is opening up to the world. Couldn't we then again create a version that is unique to China? And these are some of my perspectives on this topic. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Dean Wang, for the presentation. Through your discussions, people will continue to have more in-depth thinking on how we can find unique solutions and questions to this important question. We would now like to give the floor to Zhang Hongyuan, the moderator for our roundtable for this panel. He had frequently visited the rural areas and understood the challenges faced in the rural areas in China for education equity. So now we would like to give the floor to him. Well, thank you very much, everyone listening in. Greetings to you, teachers, colleagues, and fellow scholars. Good morning and good evening to you. Today, I am one of the panel directors for this panel, and I would like to also host the roundtable discussion. We thank the four speakers for sharing with us their insights from different perspectives. And I believe after that, you now have a better understanding as to the current situation of rural education in China. Now we'll go into the roundtable discussion part of the panel. Our panelists are renowned experts in this area. I would like to take this opportunity to seek your wisdom on some of the dire questions and challenges in this field. The first question to you all is something that had been touched upon in your presentations in different perspectives. At the moment, because of the experience, salary, education background, geographical location, and so on and so forth, rural schools don't have as good a faculty as urban schools usually. Will you be able to interpret the reason for that and perhaps provide some solutions? The question is first directed at Professor Chen. You talked about the One Village, One School project. One preschool project, will you be able to share with us some wisdom on how to improve their quality of teaching? Thank you very much, moderator. In our project, we have realized and discovered some of the experiences that can be rolled out to other places. We need to hire local train the locals, and serve the locals. And this is a consensus that was reached. We need to hire people who are local residents, young local residents, hire them and help train them to join in the teaching practices. And they would have the problems that you talked about. Their previous training might not be adequate, but we believe, especially in preschool education and in the interaction with children, they would be able to do that job to a satisfactory level. And we provide constant guidance to them and training to them so that they can understand some of the key skills and key capabilities as they interact with the children. I fully agree that every adult would know which is the best way to interact with children. We know how to provide the best to our children. What we need to do and learn is to internalize that into the actual teaching of our children with love and care and consideration. And so we have summarized some of the most effective ways, such as building WeChat groups, have real-time feedback to the teachers. And these are very simple measures that can help our teachers to think about it for 5 to 10 minutes. Think about the activities they're going to organize for the children on the next day. Think about the teaching content. They don't have to be equipped with a lot of lofty ideas or very strong theoretical background. They can still pay attention and focus on practice, and they can notice the small changes in the children. For example, we can discuss with the teachers a specific question, how to respond to a question that was raised by a child. These are very simple exchanges, but these are very effective because we can help the teachers to understand how they can improve their ability to interact with the children. And we believe this is the key competence for a teacher. Once we hire the locals and train the locals, there is a big advantage because the retainment rate is high. There is an opportunity for them to take root in their original birthplace or their local area. They wouldn't be moving around as much. They would interact with the local community, with the parents of the children. So we believe that is a model that to a large extent can motivate young rural residents to become teachers. The CIRIC Lab also have researchers now conducting research to encourage those young mothers, the mothers who are not going to go to other cities to work as migrant workers. We're encouraging them to become preschool education providers to children in the village. We're still trying to test that out and enable rural mothers so that they can become potential education providers. Thank you very much, Professor Chen, for that. You have mentioned that in your comments, we might not be able to provide enough monetary incentive for urban teachers to go to the villages. We can't ourselves go to the villages and stay there forever to teach the children there, but we can, through WeChat and through training sessions, improve the capabilities of the local teachers so that this become a long-term and effective solution to that issue. Thank you very much for your comment. Our next question, our next panelist to speak is Professor Chen. Professor Qin, you talked about how government could improve salary levels or provide training to teachers to help them improve their teaching quality. So the question is, what do you think is something that the policymakers need to resolve most urgently? Thank you very much. I believe that in the development of education, government plays a critical role, an integral role, because education is extended and large-scale course that cannot be done without the support of national government. First of all, in the investment of resources, like you said, it would require huge resources input, and this will not be done by any individual, however much goodwill he or she might have. And so the national government is providing a foundation to pave the way for it to become better. And in this sense, the government needs to do its job with its policy. And the government also can work to improve equity. In the allocation of resources, this is something the government need to do. In different period of time, there will be different strategic priorities. At the moment, we're looking at the small-scale schools and boarding schools in villages and townships. And for those poverty-stricken areas and remote areas, providing them with macro transfer payments and micro specific assistance, such as in buildings and in facilities. So sometimes we actually have these schools have received a lot of national support, but such support is relatively invisible to the everyday Chinese citizen. The national government is doing a lot, and we can say in the improvement of education equity, everything has the country's, the national government's footprint in it. And so we need to have a more in-depth understanding of the government's role. What I have said today was only a part to that phenomena. And secondly, there is a very important resource at the hand of the government, which is the institutional or system resource. This actually is very powerful. So if the country focuses on revitalization of the rural area, then that means the national government endorses the development of the rural areas. And this also is the same case when the national government pays attention to rural education. Administrators in different levels of governments will do work in this area, and this will be considered their performance, and they will be incentivized by doing work towards this direction with promotions and other incentives. And so this is, and thirdly, the national government is very powerful in leading public opinion. So the mainstream public opinion would be to support the development of rural education to meet the gap between urban and rural education environments. So objectively, any effort made towards that goal would be encouraged. And whatever you do, if it is not in line with the mainstream advocacy of the country, you would not receive as much support. And this objectively created a very conducive environment for rural education to develop. And this is something I believe is very important. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Qin, for that. You have mentioned that the national government is allocating resources, policy, and by guiding public opinion to improve the quality of rural education. And this is a very strong supporting force. I would like to direct the question to Mr. Zhao now, because you have shared in your presentation talking about the structural issues of rural education. What are some of your takes on that question? In the past, we know, and Dean Wang would know, that there are actually some structural issues in the rural education. For example, the first time when I talked to the national 2014 was the first time for me to look at the National Education Action Plan and project. Before that, there wasn't any training programs at provincial and national level.
We know what it means if teachers are left without most updated knowledge. And I am still talking about the enforcement of education equality and equity. Well, we focus on implementation of the existing policies. Let me give you a really good example. Well, art and music education in rural area is provided by social media these days. All the music that children are exposed to. Well, the International Children's Day is coming up on the 1st of June, and students actually learn music and the programs they want to perform from TikTok and alike. And the internet surely has provided a lot of these resources, which is applaudable, but we have to look at the larger picture here. Local people have a passion about their life, and they also have lots of experience as well as knowledge about music. What do I mean is when we were younger, on the senior teachers in schools would provide us music classes. Well, I'm from Altai in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, and the senior teacher would just play the horse-headed fiddle, which is a local musical instrument, and teach children local folk music. In Chongqing, and now some teachers are actually making music instruments with willow tree branches, and in Guizhou, the teachers are also making their own instruments. When I did surveys, I saw that teacher is well trained from normal and teaching on backgrounds that lack those innovative skills. Without a passion towards life, I don't think a teacher is able to have the same level of interesting music education. We now see a drastic decrease of in terms of the number of rural schools, which means diminishing rural education resources. Many rural teachers these days are inviting senior citizens in villages to participate in education. Now, because of urbanization, there are very few young people left in villages, but these senior citizens are able to, still bring handicraftsmanship, including musical instruments to campuses. I heard a story from a volunteer who is a horseman who said he knows very little about music theory, but when he herds his sheep, he plays on the horse-headed fiddle on where he really instills his passion of life, of nature. He herds his sheep in nature, and his playing of the music actually reflects a way of living of the nomadic lifestyle. We now look at rural from the perspective as an urban citizen, but rural education needs more than internet, but rather things from villages within. These are not cultivated by cities, but rather discovered from within. It's the passion that they have towards their own homeland. When we were in Henan province, Professor Wang knows very well that there are a lot of villages that are off the grid. The good thing about Henan is that the faculty team is able to find a locality in education which is missing from the policy level. We want to see more folk on culture elements and that are not originated from urbanization in education, so that the fundamentals of the Chinese traditions can be retained. I think for the past and in the future, we would like to devote more charitable resources and support to rural schools of this kind. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very beautifully said. You said the rural culture is being impacted by urbanization. We need to preserve and conserve the traditional culture in rural areas. So, Professor Wang, what do you think in terms of the challenges that rural education faces today? Thank you, moderator. If you look at my background, you know that I used to teach in a village when I was 17 and 18. I was one of those teachers that was paid 5 or 6 yuan only. I do have some experience of rural education. I am still in close contact with rural schools in that village. I just check up on them from time to time. It is definitely necessary for us to look at on education equity and how it has changed in the past century. It is a centennial problem. When now I find that books donated there are not read. They accumulate dust in libraries only. That should not be the case. In the past, everybody would jump at books. It seems like students today are much less passionate about reading compared to the era of a cultural revolution even. I agree with what the previous speaker said. If you have the chance to visit Harvard University, I think we can connect all dots together and have a true reflection on education system, in particular knowledge system. Rural education, in my view, can be done through several channels. First, IT, on second, development of knowledge on standards. Standardization is crucial. We can't have things that are not fitted to the rural circumstances. Many schools have curriculum that are drafted from completely different environments that do not adapt to local situation. This only hinders the enthusiasm of the students, and we need change on that front. Also, I think we need to employ modern tools, as Hongzhi pointed out. Well, the 21st Education Research Institute can totally utilize internet and collaboration with local government, and through dialogues and exchanges a sharing of success stories that promote education equality and restructuring of the education structure, etc. We can find pilot programs on conduct policy dialogues. And between rural and urban areas, my suggestion is that we can have very good complementarity. Now we see in the past I worked on the grassroots levels. The grassroots infrastructure and in urban areas is no better than rural areas. And in the aging society, we see some senior citizens in urban areas are completely left neglected, and they are, their bodies are not even discovered days after they passed away because they live alone. Well, that would not happen in rural areas. So back to education, we can certainly put on a different pair of glasses while acknowledging the challenges and problems of cities. Well, we should not overly praise cities while we develop and improve rural areas, and so that we can have a broader vision in implementing the macro level policies of the country. And that is my base. That's my basic ideas. Well, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for your insights on rural and urban education. I believe now everyone is more informed about what action could take to support rural education. I hope and the discussions also provide you more inspirations. Now, Rachel, the floor is back to you. Really great exchanges. I can believe time flies so fast, and that brings us almost to the end of the discussion session. Once again, I would like to advocate all of you to join us. We hope and experts and scholars can introduce innovation to rural areas in order to fill up the gap between rural and areas. And we advocate practitioners and researchers to introduce more talent education to improve the overall education quality in rural areas. And we advocate that practitioners and researchers can integrate available resources to promote the comprehensive development of rural students. We advocate the society to continue to pay attention to rural education and to do your utmost to promote the equitable distribution of educational resources. Once again, I would like to thank the four panelists to the panel on education equity. Now let's welcome Wu Ya-Cong back as the moderator for the next session. Thank you, moderator. Great moderation.